I'm Shane Morris. Thanks for listening to the Breakpoint Podcast. What does the Thanksgiving holiday say about the American character? As Christianity retreats in the public square, are we in danger of losing an authentic sense of gratitude? And can Thanksgiving become a holiday that once again unites Americans in this divided political age? Author Melanie Kirkpatrick joins John Stonestreet to discuss her outstanding book, Thanksgiving, the holiday at the heart of the American experience.
Well, on Monday of our podcast, I welcomed Peter Leithart, and we had a robust conversation on the entire idea of gratitude and the worldview that gives us kind of a framework for gratitude that's more than just kind of a tit for tat, and how this has impacted history, how it's impacted nations. And it's all part of kind of a Thanksgiving series. And I wanted to invite part 2 of that series. If you didn't listen to Monday's conversation, it was really spectacular, as is today's. But I want you to go back and listen to that because it really frames up what we're going to talk about today with Melanie Kirkpatrick. If you don't know that name, Melanie, for years was the deputy editor of the editorial page at the Wall Street Journal. She's a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, member of the Human Freedom Advisory Center of the George W. Bush Presidential Center. She's one of those whose biographies is so impressive. It's hard to read it all, Melanie. It's really an honor to have you as a guest here on the Breakpoint Podcast.
Well, thank you so much for your very kind words, John. And one of my favorite accomplishments was the book I wrote about Thanksgiving. And so I'm delighted to be with you today to talk about that.
Well, absolutely. I'm actually tempted just because you've also written another fascinating book, and I need to get you back on to talk about Escape from North Korea. What a fascinating story that is. In fact, my wife would talk to you for hours about that book. It really has captured her imagination. And anyway, that's a fascinating book. But the book, as you said, that we're going to talk about is Thanksgiving, the holiday at the heart of the American experience. And I know this is an obligatory question to ask. Why did you write this book? But to me, I've seen your answer in various interviews, and I think it is a very interesting reason that you started to dive deep into this holiday.
It happened on September 11th, John. I was downtown outside my office at the World Financial Center, and I watched the towers fall, the World Trade Center towers fall. And as I was, like everybody, I think, not just New Yorkers, but everybody after that terrible experience, we got thinking about what it means to be an American. And so I opened the book by William Bradford, the governor of Plymouth Plantation. He wrote a journal about the Pilgrims' journey from Holland to England to what became the United States and the setup of Plymouth Plantation. And as Thanksgiving came along, I read ahead to what he had to say about Thanksgiving. And it seemed to me that the spirit of what we call the first Thanksgiving and the Thanksgiving holiday that we're about to celebrate was very much the same. And now, nearly 400 years later, it's become our country's oldest tradition.
Well, that's one of the things that struck me about your book. I mean, every nation, you mentioned this in a number of places, every nation has a national holiday. But you talk about Thanksgiving as if it's kind of a second national holiday, and not uniquely American, but certainly distinctly American. And that's what fascinated me in this connection with the conversation we had with Peter Leithart on Monday, is that gratitude doesn't flow from every framework. Not every culture cultivates gratitude. Not every country has a national story that is inherently embedded with this idea of gratitude or thankfulness. Why America?
I think it dates back to let me back up even farther. I was going to say it dates back to the Pilgrims and the Indians in the first Thanksgiving, but no, it goes back even farther. It's a Judeo-Christian heritage of our country, and the emphasis on gratitude that that religious background has taught us. And even Americans who are not religious today still, I think, feel a sense of gratitude. It's been woven into the fabric of our country. If I may verge a little bit off topic, I'll say that I am concerned that as our country becomes less religious, that spirit we're going to be able to maintain that same spirit.
Well, one of the fascinating characters in your book, and I think it's just apropos for today's culture. I mean, we've talked so much, particularly during the election season, how divided is America? How divided is America? And there's so many kind of key moments to the history of Thanksgiving that you bring up in your book. Obviously, we got to go back to the Pilgrims, and I want to do that. But there's this fascinating character, Sarah Joseph Hale, who during the Civil War is trying to find some way to foster national unity. To me, it's fascinating that her idea was, let's get everybody together to say thanks. It wasn't any sort of I mean, it was a celebration, but that's just, to me, is so fascinating that really Thanksgiving comes out of a history of division.
Yes, I think that's right. Lincoln in 1863 proclaimed a day of Thanksgiving. It was the bloodiest year of the Civil War. The Battle of Gettysburg, had taken place just a few months previously. And yet he accepted Sarah Josepha Hale's request that he call a national Thanksgiving. And if you read that proclamation, it's quite remarkable. He doesn't talk about enemies or the Confederates. He talks about the American people. And I think it was a remarkable act by a remarkable president. After 1863 and 1864, he issued a Thanksgiving proclamation again once more. And then every subsequent president has done so up to and including the present day.
But there's a history of Americans, or I guess the first settlers, calling days of Thanksgiving. That's one of the really cool things about your book. Who knew that even before the Pilgrims, Thanksgiving was kind of part of the story. But there
that's
were
exactly right.
kind of days of Thanksgiving.
Yeah, absolutely. We like to say that the Thanksgiving harvest in the fall of 1621 was the first Thanksgiving. And in truth, there were Thanksgivings before on our continent, brought by other Europeans, the Spanish who came to Florida and to Texas, the English who went to Virginia and Maine, and then the oldest example I could find of a earlier Thanksgiving was with a British explorer who went to what is now the far north in Canada. So in all of these cases, they were days of religious thanks. They were Christian ceremonies to give thanks to a safe arrival in the New World or something like that. And in several cases, the native people were invited to join them. And of course, the real first Thanksgivings on this continent were those that were practiced by the native people. And we don't have a written record of them, but some of the prayers and traditions have survived over the decades.
That's really amazing. Let's go to the story that we all know, the Pilgrims. And of course, that's a story that's been told and mistold and retold in a couple different ways. I mean, one of the things we hear is that a lot of those details were myths. Maybe the one that we see in that famous first Thanksgiving painting. But you argue in the book that, okay, that maybe the dress is off here and, details are off there. But the religious nature of it was really central. And that's one of the things that we have heard differently, I think, is that, the early Pilgrims in particular, not just the Pilgrims, but this was really more about money than it was about religious freedom. It really wasn't about God. It was about opportunity. And certainly it's the story of oppression of the native people. How accurate is the story that we know?
Well, it was about a lot of those things that you mentioned, but God was at the heart of it, in my view. Though one of the most interesting things I found about as I researched the history of Thanksgiving, and particularly what we call the first Thanksgiving, is that the Pilgrims didn't call that day a Thanksgiving. They there were two eyewitness accounts of it, and they were very descriptive about what was eaten and the good fellowship between the Indians and the Pilgrims, and also the thanks that they offered to God for their survival. But what the day they called Thanksgiving, the first Thanksgiving in the New World, was a couple of years later, 2 years later, in July of 1623, when a rainfall saved their harvest. And the governor, William Bradford, called for a day of Thanksgiving. And that was the first, from the Pilgrims' point of view, was the first Thanksgiving in the real world. At the same time, I would argue that for the Pilgrims, every day was a day of Thanksgiving. They were champions at giving thanks. They gave thanks when they woke up in the morning and before and after every meal, and at religious services on Sundays. And one of the interesting things I learned about how they gave thanks was that I was trying to find some prayers that might have survived. And the answer was they didn't. And why not? And the reason was that the Pilgrims believed in individual prayer. That is, not in set prayer, not in prayers that everybody would recite. Instead, each individual was called upon to make his own prayer to God and speak directly to God. And I thought that was a very important feature of how the Pilgrims expressed their relationship with God in the New World.
It is an interesting feature, and of course, it has to do with coming out of the Church of England, where the liturgical prayers were very much set through the Book of Common Prayer and so on. But there was I guess it just struck me throughout is how, as you described, this wasn't the first one, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. That it was essentially a common thing. And when you talk about kind of the power of culture. Culture is most powerful where it makes things seem just the most normal, which is why we talk at the Colson Center about cultural change and what's behind it. And when something goes from being unthinkable to normal, that's a pretty big shift in culture. Well, it was normal. I mean, it just seemed like great gratitude. Like something good happens, we turn our attention upwards, we pause and we say thanks. And that it was just kind of a normal part, not just for individuals, but it was just kind of embedded in the social life together.
Yeah,
to me, that seems like a really big loss.
That's exactly right, John. And another thing that was embedded in the culture and isn't still embedded in the culture of Thanksgiving today is the culture of generosity and caring for your fellow man. Again, a very Christian or very Judeo-Christian concept. But the earliest record I found of a connection between Thanksgiving and caring for the poor came in the 1630s or 1620s in Scituate, Massachusetts, where the governor called for a day of Thanksgiving and specifically exhorted the people to invite the poor to join them in their feasting on that day, to make sure they were well cared for. And of course, we see that today, where Thanksgiving has become a day when so many people try to be inclusive, invite their neighbors or friends, and not to mention their family too, to Thanksgiving dinner, and then also take care that the poor, the less fortunate in their community are well cared for. And people do that through, giving money. Americans give more money to take care of charitable causes than any other country per capita by far. But we also do it through personal contact. And you think of all the churches and community centers that host Thanksgiving dinners. And I interviewed people who did so and would talk about how they were blessed by their giving as well as the people who joined the table. For example, a woman I spoke to said how at her church, this is in New York City, they every Thanksgiving table had a host from the congregation, and they didn't do buffet. They had it served family style because they wanted the connection around the table with all the participants, and I thought that was very beautiful.
And, some of these things we just kind of take for granted as normal. I mean, that was so striking in the conversation on Monday with Peter Lightheart about, this is just kind of gratitude is normal. It's a normal part of life, but it really isn't. It's not something that's necessarily inherent to the human condition unless there's kind of a deep-seated sense, that something good has happened. One of the things that you mentioned in the book as well, that the early kind of calls for Thanksgiving days or times of Thanksgiving had to do with a response to a particular event, this particular rainfall or this particular safe journey or something like that. And that it, once it became kind of routine and normal, then it became more generalized and not specified. And that there was some concern that if it was just general Thanksgiving, like, hey, today we're going to just be thanks, and you think up what you're going to be thankful for, that it would kind of lose the punch. It would maybe stop being, as sincere because it wasn't a reaction to a specific blessing. Do you think that bore true? I mean, I guess I kind of look at today and think, are we in danger of losing this really important cultural? I mean, we'll still have the day. We still have, the Cowboys game. We still have the turkey. Gordon Ramsay's helping us keep it from being dry. I mean, there's things that we'll have. But are you worried, like, some of our forefathers and mothers were, that, it's just going to become routine, or it has become routine?
I will say, first of all, that in every century we have had critics of Thanksgiving Day who ask the question that you have just asked. And we seem to come through okay. At the end of the 19th century, the big controversy was football, which was wildly popular, taking over from the true meaning of Thanksgiving. But to answer your question, yes, I am worried. The history of Thanksgiving, suggests a positive path, suggests that I should be optimistic, that Americans are always going to celebrate this day with gratitude in their hearts. But I look at our culture and I worry about it, especially, as I mentioned earlier, the declining role of religion in our lives and in our public sphere, because it's hard to imagine, just perhaps because I've never experienced it, but it's hard to imagine generosity and thanksgiving without a religious foundation.
Well, it is. I mean, who do you think? Who are we grateful for? I mean, it was one of the brilliant parts about it that it wasn't specifically a Judeo-Christian holiday. It wasn't, only if you're a follower of Jesus can you be grateful. It was open to everyone. It was a way to kind of, I think, to borrow the language of Charles Taylor, to keep the world enchanted in a sense. But, there's a real disenchantment.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, I mean, you're right about
ahead.
that, John. But I wanted to say that this is due in part to George Washington, who issued the first national proclamation. His very first presidential proclamation was for a national Thanksgiving, and he made it clear that it was open to people of all faiths. That is, it was not a specifically Christian holiday. So I think we've been fortunate in those leaders who have come forward as the years go by. Every presidential proclamation mentions God. And as you said, today it is a holiday that is celebrated by just about everybody of almost every faith, and also of no faith. So it's, at the moment, the holiday is, and I think the holiday spirit is preserved. But going forward, I think we're going to have to work at it.
I think that's right. I mean, I don't think our biggest challenge today is football. I think it's Black Friday in terms of kind of robbing us of our thankfulness.
No, not at all. I totally disagree. Black Friday it's a positive thing for our society, because it signifies the start of the holiday shopping season for sure. But that is, people are buying things as gifts for other people. That's one positive aspect. Another possible positive aspect is that it shows the success of our system and our capitalistic system. And that is a positive thing as well. If people didn't work hard and save their money, we we wouldn't be the country we are and able to give money to help the poor and time and energy to help the poor. So I think of it.
I'd
I think
so
of it
love
as
to agree with
positive.
you on this point. I think I would so love to. In fact, I had this disagreement on a stage with Dennis Prager, who said the same thing. And here's my two caveats. Giving of gifts and giving it generously. If Black Friday represented generosity, I would agree with you completely. Here's where I struggle. Is it really a show of I mean, are we really sure that all of these folks who are trampling security guards for flat screen TVs are going to get those great deals so that they can give generously these flat screen TVs? I guess I'm maybe more cynical about the human condition, that really what it's doing is tapping into our baser instincts. And I got one more argument. And if there weren't such high levels of consumer debt to make things like this possible, that people were living within their means and giving gratefulness for the things that they have. I guess I don't see Black Friday. I definitely see it as the start of the shopping season. But to me, it's far more consumerist than generous. Although I would love to agree with you. I really would love to agree with you.
Well, I take your points, and it is hard to refute them because we all know individuals who are shopping in the spirit that you just articulated, not the one that I articulated. But I guess it's my nature to put a positive spin on things. And also, I just see how, as I mentioned earlier, the more than 100 years ago, the same things were being said about football. And before that, the same things were being, 100 years before that, people complained that there was too much emphasis on dinner and not enough on religion. So somehow, we all muddle through, and I hope we will this time around too.
You do, and I will say you do a wonderful job in the book, reminding us of these ways that kind of this gratitude recovers, even as recently as the creation of Giving Tuesday, which it's really tempting right now for us to give a very strong plug that Giving Tuesday is a great opportunity to donate to the Colson Center, but it is a great innovation to kind of try to hold gratitude with that. We're out of time. I'd love to have the conversation with you about the food part, because you do talk a lot there about kind of the innovation in food, and it's just a fascinating book. Again, the book is called Thanksgiving: The Holiday at the Heart of the American Experience, and I think it is a good thing that Thanksgiving has played such a central role to the American experience, like you say. I guess I have one more a question or comment, and you began the book with a really captivating story about visiting a school which is really for first-year immigrants, people who have, entered the country on the way to citizenship, and they're teaching them English and so on, and how significant and really surprised you were by how significant Thanksgiving was to these students. You kind of thought, the typical American, you probably got a much richer response than you would from a typical American teenager who was born here. But I guess it struck me, Os Guinness has written that one of the things that's lacking in our ability to preserve our American cultural experience is civics education. Really a sense of who we are as a people, a common sense of what it means to be an American. Certainly to do it with, the appropriate level of sensitivity to different experiences, different regions of the country, different ethnic backgrounds, different cultural experiences, and so on. But we just don't have it. I mean, even in our conversations about, closed borders and immigration, what does it mean to be an American? It seems that you experienced in that story that you told that Thanksgiving could be a wonderful opportunity to give us a start to that shared heritage.
Yeah, indeed. And I will tell you a story about that. When I visited newcomers high school, these kids were all around, 12, 13, 14, and they were about to celebrate their first Thanksgiving in the United States. And it, I was invited by a couple of teachers to come and speak to several classes, and Thanksgiving was not on the curriculum. So they had to eke time out for it, and which I thought was amazing that they were so far-sighted that they would do that. They knew that this was an important step in these kids' journey toward becoming an American. And so the kids didn't speak English too well, but they spoke enough to communicate well enough. And one boy spoke up and said he was from Tibet. Now, Tibet's a country that has not existed since 1950 when the Chinese invaded it. And he was a Buddhist, of following the Dalai Lama. And he said he wasn't able to practice his religion freely in his country. So his family came to the United States. And then here's another interesting part. A girl spoke up and she said, I had the same experience. I'm a Copt from Egypt. Copts are an ancient form of Christianity. And she said, we couldn't practice our religion in Egypt. So that's why we came to the United States. And they both said that they felt the Pilgrims were kindred spirits. And I thought that was, they had a personal understanding of the holiday in a way that a kid born here just doesn't get. And I'll make one more comment, if I may, on your question about civics education. I would like to see every high school senior in America have to pass the test to become a new American in order to receive his high school diploma. I don't know if you've ever looked at that test, but it really teaches you it demands of you, I should say, an understanding of core facts of our history that go missing in many kids' educations these days.
Well, it's been a fascinating conversation. Again, my guest today has been Melanie Kirkpatrick. She is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute and a member of the Human Freedom Advisory Council at the George W. Bush Presidential Center. The book is called Thanksgiving, the Holiday at the Heart of the American Experience, and you can find it on Amazon or any place. Come to breakpoint.org, and there on the homepage, you'll find a button that says resources mentioned on the radio and podcast, and we'll link you to a couple interviews and articles with Melanie about this book. Just really a fascinating topic, but also it will give you some great ideas on how to not just eat turkey and watch football tomorrow on Thanksgiving Day, but to actually maybe borrow some of these traditions, borrow some of the readings, statements, things like that she talks about in her book. And make sure you look up the story of Sarah Joseph Hale, fascinating story of someone who is one of the reasons that Thanksgiving is the holiday that it is for America. Melanie, it's been a fascinating conversation, and thank you
so much for
being
having
willing
me
to join us.
Great. Well, it was a great time. I enjoyed it, and I wish you and yours a very happy Thanksgiving.
Thanks for listening to the Breakpoint Podcast. From all of us here at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, have a very happy Thanksgiving.